These are pictures of equations. I've been, for the last 15 years, trying to answer the kinds of questions that my colleagues have been raising. And what I've come to understand is that there are these incredible pictures that contain all the information of a set of equations that are related to string theory. And it's even more bizarre than that because when you then try to understand these pictures, you find out that buried in them are computer codes, just like the type that you find in a browser when you go surf the web.
You're saying your attempt to understand the fundamental operations of nature leads you to a set of equations that are indistinguishable from the equations that drive search engines and browsers on our computers.
That is correct. So,
wait, I have to just be silent for a minute here. So you're saying as you dig deeper, you find computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos.
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code.
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just sort of resembles computer code. You're saying it is computer code.
It's not even just is computer code. It's a special kind of computer code that was invented by a scientist named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. That's what we find very, very deeply inside the equations that occur in string theory and in general in systems that we say are supersymmetric. Some of those codes are showing on the screen behind you right now. They don't look like codes, but these pictures, which we call adinkras, are graphical representations of sets of equations that are based on codes. That in the description of our universe, that is a supersymmetrical universe, which we were going to test in the LHC. If you believe that description, I can show you the presence of these codes. That's my statement.
Do you have any predictions in your ideas or any ways to test any of your ideas any more than, say, the guy over on the screen?
The work that I'm doing is, in fact, so theoretical that we don't understand yet whether it is even possible to complete the program. We have found these strange graphs. We know that they are equivalent to equations, and we have found in these equations computer codes. And so that's where we are right now. So I cannot give you a prediction. This work is less than 2 years old.
But it's not that you recognize that you will need a prediction in order to.
Someone recently asked me, said, well, you don't care about experiments, do you? And I said, no, that's exactly wrong, because you see, I have spent my career as a researcher worrying about supersymmetry. I would want to see an experiment before I shuffle off this mortal coil so that I know that I did not waste my entire professional life.
This is towards Dr. Gates. I'm curious about your theory. You say there's computer code in these equations. Now, computer code is generally just instructions for a processor. And I'm curious as to what the instructions you're finding are. And if you're not sure what's to say that it's actually computer code, I mean, theoretically, the number pi has all the data that's ever existed.
Well, we say that they're computer codes.
You mean the digits in pi?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. We say they're computer codes, first of all, because the structure of the equation is such that they dictate that there are certain things that are actually strings of ones and zeros. That's just digital data, but it's not just random ones and zeros. As I mentioned earlier, let me talk about something that you probably do every day, but I don't know if you're a computer scientist or not. Most of us sit at our...
Sounds that kind of fluency.
Okay, well, most of us sit at our computer screens and we type on the keyboards, and we then send these, if we're using a browser, we're sending strings of ones and zeros elsewhere. But on the other hand, in the transmission process, there's always some fluctuation. So 0 that you type here because of static in line might be read as a 1 at the other end and vice versa. And so in fact, when you sit and type on the keyboard, your computer's doing something behind your back. Namely, it throws in a bunch of extra ones and zeros, and these things are called error correcting codes, so that the computer at the other end can look at the whole collection of what you typed plus what was sent and figure out if there were bits that were being flipped back and forth. And that's how you get accurate transmission of digital data. Among the codes that are used for this purpose are a special class of codes that are called block linear self-dual error correcting codes. They were first, in fact, the Shannon extended checksum code is an example of one of these things. These are the codes that we find buried in the equations. Not just any code, but these self-dual error correcting block codes. It's quite remarkable for anyone that I've talked to. We have no idea what these things are doing there.
Any literature out?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any literature out that?
I can give you technical references that almost nobody in the world can understand.
But Jim, I thought you had a popular level article on this?
Thank you. Yes, actually, so this past June, the British journal Physics World asked me to write a popular level description of what we have found. So in the June edition of Physics World, and it's published in London, the cover story is called Symbols of Power. It's about these weird symbols that have been showing behind us. We call these things adinkras. And so for a popular level description, yes, we've written that. But other than this one popular level description, it's all technical gobbledygook. And that's a technical term, by the way.
Gobbledygook.
Thank you.
The following is a conversation with S. James Gates, Jr.
Welcome back. This is the 17th annual Isaac Asimov panel debate, and we've been going strong ever since the year 2000, when an idea surfaced in the hearts and minds of the family of Isaac Asimov, exploring a way for his memory to be preserved in the programs of this institution. And Isaac Asimov was a friend of the American Museum of Natural History. Much of the research for so many of the books that he wrote took place in and around the halls and in our libraries. And so perhaps there's no more fitting tribute to him and to his memory than to keep this celebration going. So thank you for attending. We are also streaming live on the internet, and I'm your host for this evening, Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'm the Frederick P. Rose Director of the Hayden Planetarium. There's a couple of newsy notes. This year, we sold out in 3 minutes, and it's not a particularly sustainable model. So we're going to have top people looking at how to sort of improve that next year. We don't know how yet, but the least we can do is offer it live streamed on the internet on amnh.org. So I welcome everyone from the internet universe, as well as the universe gathered here. Tonight's topic is the universe a computer simulation? Yeah. This. Do you want it to be a computer simulation? I mean, this topic is we're gonna, it's, you'll see. We've got some highly thoughtful, talented, respected people to weigh in on this. I will introduce them individually, and then we will start the panel. By the way, unlike most debates you might have heard about or read about, where there's point, counterpoint, and an argument is presented and attacked, that's not what's going to happen here. We're using the word debate loosely. Think of yourself as eavesdropping on scientists at a breakout room in a conference on this topic. So we'll all be sort of arguing with one another, and you're listening in. That's really what's going on here. And you get to see how scientists think. You get to see how arguments are contested. You get to see how resolution arrives, if it arrives at all. So afterwards, we will have a brief time for question and answer before we adjourn, before 9 o'clock Eastern time zone, Eastern Daylight Time. So join me in welcoming my first panelist this evening. He is a professor of philosophy at New York University, where he's also director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, David Chalmers. David, come on out.
Hey, looking forward to this. Thank you.
Next, we have a nuclear physicist who is a postdoctoral research associate at MIT, up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And let's give a warm welcome to Zohore Davoudi. Zohore. Next, we have someone who's actually no stranger to this panel. This may be his third visit to it. In part, the topic of this year was selected because he brought it up like a couple of years ago. And I said, man, we could do a whole subject on that alone. Let's give a warm welcome back to James Sylvester Gates. Another non-first-timer is professor of physics up at Harvard, specialist in nuclear particle physics. Give a warm New York welcome to one of our own, a graduate of Stuyvesant High School, Lisa Randall. There's a friend and colleague, an astrophysicist, also from MIT, who's done some deep thinking about this very subject and has even written a book on the topic. Let's give a warm New York welcome to Max Tegmark. Max. By the way, we are sort of lit for live streaming, and the intensity of the lights on this stage is such that two of our panelists, I think they just want to look cool, but they said they need to wear sunglasses for this event, and that's cool. Later on, I might join you. I brought my pair with me as well. If I'm feeling cool, I might do just that. Zori, I'd like to start with you. No, who should I start with here? Yes, let me start with you, Zori. Can you tell me why this topic interests you? Just give a couple of minutes just as introduction here.
Sure. So, as Neil said, I'm a theoretical physicist. My interest is in nuclear physics. In fact, I got my PhD in 2014 from Institute of Nuclear Theory in University of Washington. And the research I was focused on there and at the moment is trying to use the knowledge of the laws of nature, and in particular strong interactions, to start from a bottom-up approach and try to see what comes out in a physical system. And that's actually relevant to why I got interested in the simulation idea. And in fact, by just watching the progress that researchers in this field of simulating strong interactions have made in the several past few years, we started to wonder how could we not think about the universe itself based on the laws that we've discovered, not simulated. So the way that we actually simulate the universe, it might actually give us hints that the universe itself could be a numerical simulations. And then you would start thinking, well, let's make assumption that if that scenario is the case, and if that simulation is actually has similarities with what we do in our research, and just drawing parallels between our algorithms and techniques that we use to simulate laws of nature, and making assumption that they are similar, then what can we actually conclude about the universe as a simulation? Can we actually make predictions for the signatures that we should go after and test? So that's the approach we took, and it was a fun idea and fun paper we came up with my collaborators, Martin Savage and Silas Bean at the University of Washington. And that's basically why I'm here. I'm trying to...
So the prospect of this being true didn't freak you out at all?
No, I think it's a fun idea.
Okay, just it's fun
Yes.
for you. Okay, fine. So Max, you've got a book on this too, right? What's going on with you?
Yeah, well, already as a kid, I was always very fascinated by these very big questions about what was really going on with this reality. I remember actually lying in this hammock I had put up between two apple trees back in Stockholm, Sweden, when I was 13, reading Isaac Asimov, actually. I'm very honored to get to be here. Where it really makes you think about these big questions. And the more I learned about later on as a physicist, the more struck I was that when you get deep down under the hood about how nature works, down to looking at all of you as just as a bunch of quarks and electrons.
And you too, it's not just us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at you as a quark, no, you would come under this category
Yes,
as well.
I am a quark blob too, I confess. So, but if you look at how these quarks move around, the rules are entirely mathematical as far as we can say, Helen. And that makes me wonder, if I were a character in a computer game who started asking the same kind of big questions about my game world, I would also discover eventually that the rules seemed completely rigid and mathematical. I would just be discovering the computer program in which it was written. So that kind of begs the question, how can I be sure that this mathematical reality isn't actually some kind of game or simulation?
So you've analogized yourself to Super Mario in a is this who you are?
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
So Jim, I just remember you started all this a few years ago, in my mind at least, just triggering the idea that in your research, you found things that forced you to consider the likelihood that somebody programmed us. Could you?
Well, first of all, I would disagree with you. I'm not sure that somebody programmed us, but that's what you and I had a conversation where I pointed out that in my research, I had found this very strange thing. Physicists, I like to say we all belong to a company called Equations Are Us, because that's how we make our living, is by solving equations. And so I was just going through solving equations, and I was then driven to things that Max knows about, these things called error correcting codes. Error correcting codes are what make browsers work. So why were they in the equations that I was studying about quarks and leptons and supersymmetry? And that's what brought me to this very stark realization that I could no longer say that people like Max were crazy. Or stated another way, if you study physics long enough, you too can become crazy.
It's a corollary to that idea, yeah.
And I'm also a science fiction fan, like Max talked about his encounter with Asimov. I was reading at age 8 as opposed to 13, sir.
Snapped.
Got off the slow start.
I was reading at age 8 a science fiction book by an author named Paul French. And some people in the audience might know that's a pseudonym for Isaac Asimov.
Oh.
So science fiction drove me into science in some sense. And then now in my 65th year of life, I find out I have to make friends with Max and people like that.
So Lisa, I kind of brought you on the panel because I knew you're a rationalist in all this. And so I don't know what to expect. I just needed to anchor this in somebody who I knew was not going there. So
yeah, so I actually, well, I can't say I decided to be on the panel because I think I said, what date is it? And they were like, thank you for agreeing to be on the panel. But I have to say, I'm curious not so much about the question of whether we're a simulation, because I think it's only interesting insofar as there are ways to test it. And we can come back to that, I think, very much in terms of sort of how the laws of physics operate and whether we can actually distinguish that. But I actually am very interested in why so many people think it's an interesting question. Like, why is the audience here? Why is this because really, first approximation, we can't really distinguish it. So I think the interesting question is, why do we feel compelled to want this to be true or even think this could be true? And how do the laws of physics operate? And are there really ways that we could eventually test whether there is something that distinguishes just a true universe? But I should say, like, if the universe is a simulation, I don't understand why it gave me a cold today.
Okay.
And so my voice might go. But I also think sometimes, like, some of the ridiculous things in the universe, and think why would that be part of the simulation? And I realized if I was doing a simulation, I would definitely put those things in. So there you go.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Now, we couldn't have a panel without a philosopher, David. We needed We need some philosophical.
I know how you love philosophers now.
I'm on record for some comments about philosophers that got him a little ticked off. But anyhow, so David, philosophers have been at this for a while, yourself included. So how do you see all of this happening or fitting in to the worldview?
Well, philosophers like to ask the big questions about the world, the foundational questions, and this is one of them, Actually, I blame Isaac Asimov for all this, at least in my case. I got into thinking about these big questions. When I was a kid, I read just about everything that Asimov was writing, not just the science fiction, but the science fact, the history, the detective novels. I read the multiple volumes of his autobiography, but throughout Asimov's work, this was a guy that was just interested in the big questions about the nature of reality at all levels. That ultimately drove me to think about questions about consciousness and the mind, which I could approach as a philosopher, because philosophy allows you to kind of step back and say, what is the science here telling us? But this question about the simulation corresponds to another of the great questions of philosophy, which is basically, how do we know anything about the external world at all? And René Descartes said, how do you know you're not being fooled by an evil genius into having an impression of this world around us, even though none of it really exists? Well, the contemporary version of that question is, how do you know you're not in a simulation like the Matrix, in which case, allegedly, none of this really exists? And to me, that question is just extremely interesting, because it seems nothing we could know could rule out the hypothesis that we're in a simulation. But you also want to think about what follows. Some people think if we're in a simulation, then none of this is real. I think if you adopt the kind of perspective which, say, Max was suggesting a second ago, where the universe is all mathematical or informational, this allows us to reorient our attitude to this question, saying, okay, maybe we're in a simulation, but if we are, all this is perfectly real, because all the information is there in the simulation, all the math is there, all the structure is there in the simulation. So I'd say, well, maybe we're in a simulation, maybe we're not. But if we are, hey, it's not so bad.
If I do this, you feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That.
So that's real. That was a real punch. Yeah. So Jorge, let me ask you. I see you coming to this almost from the most pragmatic side. You've done experiments with your colleagues, or you've had hypotheses with your colleagues. Could you just detail for me where you landed in one of those papers that you guys published?
Sure. So what we did is not actually doing the experiment. We proposed that experiments could go and look for the signs of a possible underlying simulation for the universe. And the reason we thought about this, as I said, is because we've been simulating strong interactions, which means that instead of just looking at the larger structures, we start from the underlying degrees of freedom of our theory, the quark gluons that we understand. And there are very simple laws governing the interactions among these particles. However, when you think about all these complex systems of atomic nuclei and larger systems in the universe, the ordinary matter in our universe, it all emerges from those simple fundamental building blocks and these interactions. So we've been trying to just input those simple mathematical structure with a few degrees of freedom, these quarks and gluons, and then see how these, for example, atomic nuclei emerge from these simulations.
So you're building the universe from the ground up.
Exactly. So, but what are the limitations? We don't have infinite computational resources. We have very large supercomputers in the national labs, for example, that we can compute these interactions, basically, and build up these systems. However, we are still limited. And the reason is that if you're interested in simulating the universe, and that's, you don't know what the size is, it could be finite or infinite. However, we are limited to a finite size. On the other hand, if you think about even a finite size, there are infinite numbers of points on these in this finite size that you have to simulate to get the physics right. However, we are not capable of inputting infinite number of information in our computers. Also, we want the simulations to be quantum, which means that there is not just one single path of evolution from one point to the other. There are an infinite number of paths. Some are more important than the others. And therefore, there's another type of infinities that we have to implement in our simulations to get the answer right.
Yeah, but just because we can't do it because we're limited, should that mean
Okay,
the whole universe is limited?
So wait, so this is the point. So
I got time.
all right, so we can do it, right? And then based on the assumption that if there is an underlying simulation for the universe that has this problem, that has the problem of finite computational resources, just as we do, then what happens? Then the laws of nature, the quantum mechanics, and whatever interactions that are going on has to be put on a finite set of space-time points in a finite volume, and then just a finite number of quantum mechanical paths to a process can be evaluated. So these are the assumptions. So if the simulator of the universe in whatever form it is just finite computational resource and not infinite, then is limited to simulate the universe in this kind of limited scenario, just as we do. And then by making that assumption and then going back and look at our simulation and see what kind of signatures we see in the observables we calculate, that could tell us that we started from a non-continuum space-time, then apply it to an underlying simulation of the universe and make the same assumption, then what would you see? And that's basically what we look for, and list a few observables in our universe that might lead to actually constrain this scenario under this assumption. And one of which is looking at the spectrum of cosmic rays, because what happens if these very high energy cosmic rays that approach the Earth, they are actually traveling in a discrete space-time as opposed to a continuum, then their equations, basically special relativity that would describe the relation between the energy and momentum of this particle is modified. And then you would ask that, what would that modification mean in terms of the observation we make in our observatories for example, the spectrum and then distribution of these cosmic rays. And if we see something that would be that would be consistent with the scenario with limited computational resources of the universe, and then you might think about other signatures and maybe taking this scenario more seriously and think about extending.
So cosmic rays, it would be your pathway to the limits of what has ever been measured.
Exactly.
And then seeing if at that limit, you are probing the limits of the programmer
right,
of the
because
universe.
These cosmic rays are the most energetic particles that we've ever been able to observe. We can't even produce them in laboratories. These are very high energy cosmic rays.
Very higher than anything
dense.
we produced in our particle accelerator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, by orders of magnitude. And therefore, because these are very energetic, they can actually probe the fabric of a space-time. This is our way of probing if the underlying space-time is discretized or just a continuum. So
Max, you've written, like I said, you've written a book on this, yet you told me offline that you have an argument that would argue that
maybe we're not simulated after all.
Maybe we're not a simulation after all. So where does that land?
Yeah, so before giving a counter argument, let me give the pro argument. So of course.
So you can give arguments in both directions here.
It's fun to argue with yourself. Okay. So of course we all, as David mentioned, have seen the argument, the idea of us being simulated in the Matrix and in science fiction going even far beyond that. But the guy who really started forcing scientists to take this a bit more seriously and gave this idea a bit more scientific street cred, I think, is Nick Bostrom, my fellow Swede, Nick Bostrom, who published this very dry academic article just pointing out that...
He's a philosopher.
Indeed,
yes.
Indeed. And he pointed out that it seems like the laws of physics allow us to build amazingly powerful computers way beyond what we have now, solar system sized things, which could simulate minds that would feel just like us. And then he went on to say, it seems overwhelmingly likely, if you don't wipe out here on Earth, that in the future, the vast majority of all computations and all minds will be inside of such a computer, and therefore, he said, if almost all minds are simulated, we're probably simulated. So that's the pro argument. Now, sounds good, but
So just to clarify, so what you're saying is if simulating universes becomes a pastime among those who have access to highly powerful computers, and we are in a universe, we are probably in a simulated universe, even if one of those universes is actually real.
right, that's
Is that a
basically
fair?
that's the fair summary. Yeah, and if you're not sure at the end of the night whether you're actually simulated or not, my advice to you is go out there and live really interesting lives and do unexpected things so the simulators don't get bored and shut you down.
Is that the cause of death? Okay.
But now, in terms of the counter argument, if you just take Nick seriously,
That's the cause of death. My
there's
gosh.
something fishy here, because suppose you buy into this and you're like, okay, I'm sold on Nick's argument. We are simulated. Let's talk then about our simulated universe. We're measuring the laws of physics here in the simulated world. And we find that in the simulated world, we can build all these supercomputers in the future, and there will be all these simulated minds and so on. And we can make the same argument all over again and convince ourselves that actually we're doubly simulated. And then we're a simulation in the simulation. And then you can repeat the argument again and say, well, okay, we're a simulation in a simulation, but in the future, there are going to be all these simulated computers, and they're going to have all these minds. So we're actually triply simulated. No, we're quadruply simulated, and it goes on and all night. And
The turtles all the way down.
all the way down.
Yeah,
And at this
okay.
point, I get the sinking feeling that there's something rotten at the core of this argument.
Okay.
The answer is we're at level 42. That was the
Good
question.
answer.
No, 137.
137. That's the
Anyone-
fine structure
Of
constant.
course.
And I think where the problem lies is that when you make this argument, right, about what kind of minds are really the most common, the simulated or non-simulated, it assumes to answer that you have to know what the actual laws of physics are. But if we start making these sort of arguments, we have no clue what the laws of physics are. It doesn't matter what the laws here in our simulation, if it is one, are. We need to know what the real laws of physics are in the basement universe. It's the foundation. And if so, we don't really have access to that. So that's this philosophical nitpick, which seems to me swept under the rug here.
Jim, where?
Where am I? Well, first of all, I have a finger, and I look at it, and it seems to be real. And so my point of view is very conservative. Carl Sagan once said that extraordinary statements, and I'm paraphrasing.
Claims, yeah.
Right? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, Zora has told us about a kind of evidence, and that's the kind of evidence that would convince me as a physicist. But what I do is sort of a mathematical model of physics. And in our previous encounter here on this stage, I had a chance to tell you about these error correcting codes, which are a very specific kind of digital data. It's not just general digital data, it's a very specific kind. And it seemed extraordinarily unlikely. And I have to tell you that one of the reasons I enjoy talking to audiences like this is they get us experts out of our comfort zone. And so one of the first non-physicists that I talked to, or that I read reflected on my comment, said effectively, and this is not exact words, but effectively he said, if the simulation hypothesis is valid, then we open the door to eternal life and resurrection and things that formerly have been discussed in the realm of religion. And the reason is really quite simple, because if you think about a computer, if we are a simulation, then we're like programs in a computer. As long as I have a computer that's not damaged, I can always rerun the program, right? So if you really believe that we are in a simulation and there's some structure that runs that simulation, unless something damages that structure, then we can be repurposed. And so it starts to break down a very funny barrier between what people often think is the conflict between science and the conflict between faith.
So what you're saying is that if we are simulated, that means there's a code that's doing it. and that code was started at some point, and in principle, it could just be rebooted. And then all of this would happen exactly the way it happened before, because it's running the same computer program. In principle.
If one accepts the simulation hypothesis as an accurate description of nature.
I would say that's a useless exercise. What would be more interesting is to actually.
The word was useless, Jim, in case you missed that. Okay, you heard that. Okay. Emphasis on
Okay.
useless exercise. Go, Zahara, go.
Trying to repeat what you've already done with huge computational resources is useless. What is more interesting is to go and change the parameters of the simulation, the input parameters. Just put the same laws of nature, right? And then just change a little bit the value of the parameters, the very fundamental parameters of our universe, and then let it run and see what happens. And it's actually very interesting idea.
It's a fun thing to do,
Exactly.
as a
And
scientist.
But
and
in
we know that
changing
there
those parameters, you might cancel out my existence, in which case I don't think that's very useful.
The universe without Jim. So Lisa, isn't this some of the foundation? Couldn't we account for a multiverse in this very way? That multiple universes, as I understand them, will have slightly different laws of physics. Maybe they are themselves the experimenters'
Okay,
search.
so let's slow down a bit here. So first of all, I actually want to address some of the things that have come up already. One of the questions is probability, Bostrom's argument or whatever, that we're likely to be in a simulation. I mean, part of the problem is that probabilities have to have a well-defined meaning, or only useful when they have a well-defined meaning. So among all possible scenarios, we can actually say which one is more or less likely. When we run into infinities, it stops making sense. I mean, I could say, really by probability, I'm very likely to be Chinese. Because there's a lot more Chinese than Americans, but I'm clearly not Chinese. So probabilities are tricky, and you have to be careful what you mean when you're saying them. Another thing is, I actually find the egotism of thinking that if there were simulators around, that they come up with us kind of audacious and ridiculous. I mean, I think there's a very self-centeredness to this whole thing that kind of I find hilarious. But in terms of in terms of feedback in terms of error correcting code, I think it's very likely that there are going to be feedback mechanisms in whatever universe survives, because if there aren't, I mean, there's always going to be mistakes. And if mistakes can propagate and just cut things off, those universes don't survive. So there have to be, I mean, for any universe, simulated or non-simulated, there has to be error correction. So that has to be part of it.
Right, that assumes that the programmer makes the same kind of programming that is susceptible to programming errors and programming bugs that we are.
It's not even intentional. It could be just that the computer itself is subject to error. I mean, it's only firing things somewhat randomly. I mean, ultimately, there's uncertainty in everything. Nothing is created perfectly.
Quantum uncertainty.
Can I jump in here? Because she's raised, in fact, I think, a incredible point about this. And may I take a few times? I'll see minutes back later.
Yes.
There you go. This point about error correction is something that when people general public has looked at my work, they say, oh, you must believe in simulations. And I've said, no, actually, I don't. And the reason is because precisely the point that Lisa points out. If you look in all of nature and ask, are there any other places in nature, not in engineering, not in computers, not in the things that we build, but in nature herself, is there a discussion in science about error correcting codes? It turns out there's one place and one place only that I have been able to identify. That's in evolution and genetics. And there's been a discussion.
Any biological system.
Right, or any biological, right. And it's not that we think life is some kind of programmed simulation. It's because the universe itself, as Lisa has said, has to have feedback mechanisms that basically sustain a structure that propagates faithfully forward in time. And I think that's, in fact, the most critical point. And you have your time now.
Thank you. And anyone who wants to take my time to agree with me. but as far as the multiverse theory goes, so we have to be careful what we mean by that. I mean, at some underlying level, we still think it's physics in action. Now, what might change in different universes? We might actually have different forces. We might actually have different strengths of interactions, the kind of thing that gets simulated. I mean, we simulate strong interactions the way that we're described.
Just to be
Maybe-
clear, strong interactions are the forces that bind atomic nuclei. And you
So
have-
protons.
Yeah, you have protons that are the same charge that are sitting right next to one another in a nucleus. And how's that even possible when we were taught that like charges repel? So there's got to be a really strong force down there holding it together. And there is a really strong force. It's called the strong force. Okay, so go on.
Which is strong.
Yeah, that's right. Okay,
So
just to be clear.
So, and there can be different possibilities for what these parameters can be. It's still underlying, you still believe that there's the laws of physics that are operating. So the question, so it's not a simulation. It's just, it's in principle possible that there are universes we don't communicate with that are so far away, we'll never send a signal, they'll never send a signal. So for all intents and purposes, there just are different universes. That doesn't mean they're simulated, it just means they're different from ours and they can have different properties. To really distinguish as simulation, you really do have to see just our whole notion of the laws of physics breaking down, or some of the fundamental underlying properties. So it would be extremely interesting to look for the kind of violations of Lorentz invariance that were discussed earlier, or things like quantum entanglement no longer holding, not because of interaction with the environment, but just this computer just couldn't keep track of stuff. So this stuff that gets so, a lot of the simulation idea, to simulate the universe, you need the computational power of the universe. So all of the simulations are based on the idea that there's some approximations that we don't see, that you have to be able to hide them. So so what we're really looking for is the breakdown of the assumption that those approximations are valid.
But David, what do your philosophical circles say about proposing an experiment that might falsify these ideas?
Look, I don't think you're going to get conclusive experimental proof that we're certainly not going to get conclusive experimental proof that you're not in a simulation. I suppose we could get some kind of very strong.
Well, why not? You just declared something. Why can't a clever person come along and
because any evidence that we could ever get could be simulated. That's basically the reason. I'm sorry. Maybe.
Okay. So if I find evidence that we're not simulated, the great simulator.
They could have just planted that for you.
Put that in.
Yeah, they were one step ahead. However,
Okay,
maybe
we're done.
we probably could get pretty strong evidence that we are simulated. If someone wrote up in the sky, "Sorry guys," the stars suddenly rearranged themselves into, "Sorry guys, it's all a giant simulation," and then they took over the internet.
Except it would be in Chinese to get the most number of people to.
Very good. Then we'd probably have pretty good reason to think we're in a simulation, either that or the weirdest non-simulated universe that anyone ever imagined. So I'm not sure, for a philosopher anyway, it's not fundamentally a matter of experimental proof. It's cool. I really like Zori's experimental evidence that we're in a simulation. But I think around here, it's really important to make a distinction. Wait. There's a hypothesis that we're in a simulation. And there's a hypothesis that the universe is computational. Those are closely related. If we're in a simulation, the universe is fundamentally computational. But it's not true that if the universe is fundamentally computational, we're necessarily in a simulation. Because the simulation hypothesis is a combination of two things.
That's an official thing. The simulation hypothesis.
Yeah. Like the simulation hypothesis is we're in a computer simulation. A computer simulation is a computation that was created by someone for a purpose. So basically the simulation hypothesis is that computation hypothesis plus something else about someone who created it. And around here is where you might be able to get all theological and say, okay, well, it's a naturalistic version of a God hypothesis. But anyway, so my worry about Zori's stuff, which is really cool, it's really evidence for the much weaker hypothesis that the universe is some form of discrete computation, and it's completely neutral on the question of whether this is actually a simulation in the sense of something
with
which
intent
is created by a simulator.
So Max, do you mind if I call you Mario from now on? Because if you're Mario in the computer game.
Starts with MA, so I guess I get really grateful for the two letters I get, yeah?
I imagine Mario, someone coming into a Mario game and calculating how high he jumps and how fast he runs and coming up with the laws of physics of the game and possibly then questioning why is it that and not something else, perhaps. And so why would that allow someone in the game to have any understanding of what's outside the game?
Yeah, that's a really deep and good question. If Mario can never even if he figures out exactly the rules of his world,
Then he just figures out the
won't even know
rules.
if he's running on a Mac or a Windows box or a Linux box, right? Because all he has access to is this higher level of this sort of emergent reality. We might, at some level, be stuck in that situation in physics also. It's quite fascinating to think that so much of what we figured out, for example, about how a glass of water works with waves and vortices and things, we figured out already without having a clue about the substrate. We didn't even know there were atoms, But the same kind of questions that you're asking, which I think are awesome, the kind of questions where you ask, suppose this is actually somehow simulated, suppose the simulator is cutting corners, how would that show up? Actually, it has been incredibly useful in the past. If you imagine going back 200 years and trying to simulate this water as an the continuous liquid where there's a pressure and a density that has to be defined with infinitely many decimal places and infinitely many points, that sounds horrible to simulate. So maybe whoever did that cut corners, maybe there's a smallest kind of chunk of object, let's call it atom or something. You can figure out then what are the kind of departures from this simplified continuous physics that I'm guilty of teaching my undergrads at MIT about this morning, and you would figure out, there's this one little thing which is different.
A few hours ago from Cambridge. Thank you for coming in.
Brownian motion, that things should jiggle around in a sort of weird way, and Einstein found that, got the Nobel Prize for it partly, and I think that the sort of thing you're doing is awesome. Look for corner cutting evidence. I suspect that whether it's simulated or not, there are a lot of things that are wrong about what we assume today. I am very skeptical that we really have a continuous space that can be stretched infinitely many times. It seems like some sort of simplification that we came up because it was easier to do the math.
But do you ever ask why should that be the case? Why do we need a discretized universe? I mean, if you put away the simulation hypothesis or a computational hypothesis, why should we even think about a discretized universe? Why not continuum?
So this is an important I don't want to call it a problem in physics, but a reality of physics, that our macroscopic world looks continuous to us, and that has a certain simplicity of modeling. And then as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, it's no longer continuous. And it's discrete, which may be easier to calculate than being able to be divisible all the way down to an infinitesimally small bit. Because now you need that much bigger a computer to do it. By the way,
you know something that none of us actually know. This is actually a real question, whether space is discrete at really small scale.
Well, we run into this problem when we do flyovers in the Hayden Planetarium. We have a data set for a planetary surface, let's say Mars. And you're at a given distance, and from that distance you can see Olympus Mons, the biggest mountain around, and Valles Marineris, and you say, fine, now I want to get closer. Well, to get closer and have more information come to you, you have to swap in a higher resolution map. And we try to do that continuously so you don't realize that. So you keep doing this, and then you reach a point where we don't have more resolution to give you. So we actually hold you back so you don't go closer. But if you did, all of a sudden you see these discretized pixels of the Martian surface. And that's basically because we don't have the data. We're not there. It doesn't exist for us.
So anyone who's used one of these virtual reality devices like the Oculus Rift knows there's something called the screen door effect. It's like you can see, if you look closely enough, you can see the pixels. So it's not a perfect simulation. So I guess really what Zora is doing is saying, well, we can get empirical evidence for a screen door effect in real physics.
Yeah, I think it's actually a deeper question than that. It's not about not having enough data to resolve those distances, but to some extent that's true. But the problem is that something that even bothered Feynman a lot, that why do you need infinite numbers of degrees of freedom or infinite amount of information to describe a very tiny chunk of a space-time? That just doesn't make sense. You can pretty well describe the physics without actually needing that infinite amount of information.
What I meant to add is that when we're zoomed down to Mars, it's not only that we don't have the data, even if we did have the data, you would need that much bigger disk space to have it ready and loaded to be able to go from the bird's eye view down to any kind of small, I mean, we rapidly run out of capacity to calculate.
And that's a great controversy that even mathematicians have been really arguing passionately about for over 100 years. Like Gauss, one of the greatest mathematicians ever, said, or Kronecker actually said that God created the integers and everything else is just the work of man, and all these continuous real numbers with decimal places and stuff. And I mean, frankly, as a physicist, it feels kind of hubristic that even though that, to say that you need an infinite amount of information to figure out the height of my wine glass or anything. Nature seems perfectly
There's
able
water
to
in that
figure
glass,
out
by the
what's,
way.
what to do. And yet we have this toy model that you need an infinite amount of information to do things. I think you're onto something very deep there, Zora, and that nature actually, that infinity is just something we made up for convenience. And as we dig deeper, we're going to find that maybe even space and time itself is at some level digital.
So can I just say something by way of clarification, which is just in physics, we don't actually prove any theory. We can rule out theories. So you can rule out a lot of alternative theories, but in any case, you can always have the possibility that you can dig deeper and find that whatever theory you thought was the most fundamental has some underlying structure. And so that's why all the physics we've done works. That's why we really don't need to have an infinite amount of information anytime, because we don't have access to an infinite amount of information. And we can't even ask the question or tell whether or not there's this underlying infinite amount of information. So it's not just, we can't just ask the question whether the universe is simulation. We can't ask if any physical theory is absolutely correct. We'll never know the answer to that. All we can know is that we've tested it up to a certain level, at a certain level of precision, over a certain range. And so these questions all come in, and that's why I can describe this glass of water without knowing about atoms, because I wasn't doing an experiment where the effects of the atoms became manifest. And the same might be true of the universe as a whole. So we can have in the back of our mind there may or may not be an infinite number of degrees of freedom, but that's not what we're actually testing.
Just to disagree on one thing though, I think there's one fantastic example where we can tell and makes a huge difference. I think the biggest embarrassment we have, arguably in fundamental physics and cosmology right now, is this fact that inflation, if it goes on forever, it makes this multiverse, and then we can't calculate probabilities, like you so eloquently said in the beginning. That comes exactly from the infinity assumption. The idea that you can take a piece of space and just keep stretching it into twice the size, forever. So
Well, it
I
doesn't
think we
have to
should
be
question
infinite.
that.
It could just be a large number. It could be 10 to the 500. I mean, it doesn't really matter if we say it's infinite or we just say it's a lot.
But you can calculate probabilities as long as it never gets infinite. It's exactly the infinity that kind of.
So he's cool with 10 to the
gets us.
500 is what he's saying, which seems like a really big,
I know.
that like equals infinity to me, I think.
But that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point.
Jim, is there any functional difference at all between admitting that we live in a computer simulation and saying that that's basically a secular God? What's the difference?
Well, first of all, I've decided my name should be Morpheus, not Jim.
Okay. Well, let
I'm
me.
Mario. Nice to meet you, Morpheus.
Morpheus.
Exactly.
Yes. You have to see the movie Matrix and play video games to follow this conversation at this moment.
But
Morpheus.
But as I said, for non-scientists, because I'm going to make this partition, I think for non-scientists, an acceptance of the simulation hypothesis as an accurate view of our universe is equivalent, I believe, to the notion of a deity. I don't understand how for non-scientists you can make that distinction. For scientists, however, we are rather secular. The definition of science is actually a secular definition. And in fact, it's the definition that comes to us from Galileo. Einstein quotes Galileo as being the father of all science because Galileo, and these are Einstein's words, drums into us that contemplation alone, without observation of nature, is totally useless in trying to come up with an accurate view of nature. So it's the ability of us, our human ability to observe the universe that actually defines science. So if you can't give me something that I can observe, I don't know how to do science.
Okay, so what you're saying is that if in fact there is a programmer who would be philosophically equivalent to a creator and you can't observe them, they're just outside the realm of science.
I think that's a definition.
David, you have to be defined by that.
Well, I think there's a theological reading, if you like, to the simulation hypothesis. It says all this was created But what's interesting is that at the same time, it can be seen as a kind of a naturalistic theology, a naturalistic hypothesis from the point of view
Is
of
that the first time the phrase has ever been uttered? A naturalistic theology?
I think it's out there already.
Oh, it's out there. Okay, good. All right.
Simulation theology. You heard it first. Simulation theology is the coolest kind of naturalistic theology. From the point of view of
Actually, there's a book in 1750, or who was it?
Yeah, David Hume was into.
No. There was
naturalism.
who's the fellow who wrote the book, the Natural Theology? And there's a book with that very title.
Yeah.
But not natural simulation or simulated theology.
If you think about it from the point of view of the simulated, I mean, we in this universe can create simulated worlds, and there's nothing remotely spooky about that. You know, people are already doing it with virtual reality and The Sims and Second Life and whatever. This is just a far more sophisticated version of that. So we just need to move that picture to the next universe up and say, hey, maybe that's what's happening to us. So we got a creator, but our creator isn't especially spooky. It's just some teenage hacker in the next universe up. Mom's calling him into dinner. You know. So
Working in the basement, yeah.
So I think you could be led to at least entertain this idea by perfectly naturalistic ideas, as say Nick Bostrom was, and say, okay, maybe this is the kind of theology which even someone who's got no sympathy for spooks and gods and ghosts needs to object to.
So that's an interesting point, because we don't think of ourselves as deities when we program Mario, even though we have all power over how high Mario jumps, because that's a line in the code. So you're right, you just take it up a few notches. There's no reason to presume they're all powerful, other than just they fully control everything we do, say.
It could be they're all powerful. I got into this from watching my 5-year-old nephew playing with one version of The Sims or Sim Life or something. He'd make a whole town, he'd build up the buildings and get the trees and the jungles and the creatures, and then he'd say, now comes the good part. And he'd send down fires and floods. And so it's like, finally, I understand the God of the Old Testament.
So you're saying
because it is true in our world, we have fires and floods. I played one of those Sims, Sim City, because I'm a city kid, and the early low-res simulation. And there's a feature, you build up you need money. You're mayor of a city, and you construct buildings, and you need the schools and the fire departments. And then every now and then, Godzilla stomps through your city, and you say, well, that's not real. I'm trying to be real. But then it's kind of real in the sense that some major disaster you will confront, like Hurricane Sandy or 9/11. Now you've got to redistribute resources. So I look at our real world, and these things actually do happen. So are they just trying to mess with us? Is that?
Well, the way I think about, I mean, who knows whether there's actually a simulator who's actually doing any of this. But if you do take the simulation hypothesis seriously, it's got a couple of elements of a traditional God. This person could be all-knowing about our universe, could be all-powerful. The one thing which is probably missing is wisdom and benevolence. And, if there's a simulator, I refuse to worship you. You may be out there, but you have not established yourself as being worthy of worship.
Right, because they're all powerful, all-knowing, but not all good.
Give him a break.
There's no reason to think they're all
Cut him
good.
some slack. He's only 5 years old.
You better be maturing one of these days.
So
Yeah,
all right.
I think there is a big danger in trying to compare our idea of simulation with what comes in computer games. But we're talking, at least in my point of view, and I think a physicist's point of view, what calls the simulation is you just input the laws of physics, and then nature and universe emerges. You don't actually try to make it look like it's something going on. You don't try to the same as with the computer games. You don't interfere with what you've created. You just input something that is very fundamental and just let it go, just as our universe. So I think
like
there is
deism.
I think if you take,
In other words, you set the laws into motion and let the universe unfold,
Exactly.
however those laws prescribe.
Because a priori, you don't know what happens, because the universe is complex. The laws of physics are simple, but you don't know what kind of complexities you should expect. And then you just let it run, and things emerge, and you just watch.
But Lisa, in the search for the theory of everything, isn't that got a little bit of this in it? Once you find the theory of everything, and you've been on 2 of our theory of everything panels here, you're going to find out the one equation that the 5-year-old working in the garage wrote down that made our entire universe.
Well, you might recall, since I've done this a couple of times, that the theory of everything, I think, is very badly named for a lot of these reasons. Because even with the equations, as was pointed out earlier, you could start your system very different ways. You can have different conditions. And there's a lot that we don't understand. I mean, even if I understood it, quantum gravity at a fundamental level and could derive all the equations, that's still not going to help me predict waves at a practical level. I mean, the computer simulation will never be that detailed, in my opinion. It's much better to go to different levels and figure out what's going on at what I would call an effective theory approach. So even with the fundamental equations, now sometimes, I mean, clearly if you had infinite computing power, then you would just be literally mimicking the universe, and possibly you could do that. But short of that, you're going to have to find these approximations, these descriptions that are sort of somewhat in between. They're still science. They're not something I'm just making up. They're still equations that work, and they ultimately are attributable to whatever is that fundamental equation. But that doesn't mean it's fundamentally how we're computing it. It doesn't mean it's fundamentally how it's working.
But Zahra, you started this whole discussion by describing trying to obtain an understanding of the basic forces of nature and the particles and build up from there. But isn't there surely a gap between what you know drives the behavior of individual particles and what might be emergent features in a macroscopic system? Isn't that true with the gas laws? We learned gas laws in first week of chemistry, but I don't know that you can get the macroscopic gas laws by knowing every single particle at every single instant. I don't know that they're fully reducible to that. So can you admit the possibility that there are gaps and that there's emergent phenomena so starting at the very basic level won't get you there? Is that possible?
I do admit to that, and it is in fact a
Okay,
gap
good.
in our-
Thank you. Admit to it.
No.
No.
No, this is indeed a field of research now. For example, in nuclear physics, we know these microscopic features about particles and building blocks of that contributed in strong interactions, but we don't know exactly how to get this complex system of nuclei. So, and we have very good microscopic and phenomenological models to describe all these larger scale phenomena, but we still don't know how to get them from this phenomenon. So that's what, as
But in
physicists, have
principle,
to.
if you could do it, I mean, if you had infinite computing power,
Yeah.
in principle, you could actually see a system that exhibited the gas laws. The question is whether we as scientists would call them deriving the gas laws. It wouldn't be a very useful description. It would mean that we'd have to have these enormous computations every time to do it, rather than solve an equation that, as you know.
Oh, so I never heard that before. You're assuming that if in fact we could compute the behavior of every single particle in a gas, that out of that would emerge the macroscopic gas laws.
Well, it would behave according to the gas laws. That doesn't mean that you would
Okay,
know what those gas
that's
laws are.
confident. So what you're saying is it's not emergent, because I'm intrigued. Which of you mentioned the water?
Emergent means it emerges from the fundamental laws.
Because we understood to a very high degree fluid dynamics long before we knew that fluids were made of atoms.
Right.
And I don't know how much the public knows that atoms are, though the idea is old, evidence that atoms are real is relatively recent. And even in as recently as the year 1900, it was still kind of not sure. Right. And it wasn't really until Einstein and Brownian motion in 1905 where there's really good evidence that atoms were real things. Yet we had full understanding of fluid dynamics in any way that mattered for us.
But I think we also now can derive fluid dynamics from the atomic description in certain cases, not all of fluid dynamics, but some of the properties of condensed matter physics we can derive.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. So we're still talking about reducible things.
They're two separate things, though. We mustn't conflate. On one hand, I think in principle, one can derive all of these higher level things. I think ultimately even consciousness, like David Chalmers is working on, from starting out with the quarks and stuff.
Going to be consciousness into this?
In practice, on the other hand, whether we humans are smart enough to figure it out, that's a whole different story. And I think I'm guessing that's what you were getting at there. You weren't saying that there's some mysterious epistemological gap that we can't.
Oh, no, that's not what I meant.
But that we might not be able to understand.
We haven't yet have the resources and probably enough tools and understanding to fill that gap, but the fundamental equations are there. It's just a matter of when we actually get there. So there's
I'm
nothing
curious,
mysterious.
this brings me to a point that we did not discuss earlier in the notes that we shared. When I think of you can know everything you can about cell biology, about how life works. And it's not obvious to me that by just studying a single life form, that you can derive evolution by natural selection, that's an emergent phenomenon given the system. So if it's emergent, then no one actually programmed it in to do that. That's just something that resulted.
Right. So the way I would describe it is I'd say that the fundamental, whatever is fundamentally there, that substrate is essential to whatever happened, but it's not necessarily essential to your description of what happened. And so the laws are following from this, but it's not giving an explanation. So I can note that there's atoms, but it doesn't help me predict what will happen when I throw a ball. I mean, in principle, I could probably figure it out based on that, put it all together, but it won't help me. It's so inefficient. So it's much better to have a description of a solid ball, even though it's made of atoms, which are actually mostly empty space. So that solid ball description leaves all of that out, and it works just fine. It tells me exactly where the ball will land.
David, you and your consciousness cronies, is it generally recognized that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon of a complex brain?
Yeah, well, this word emergence is kind of a word that people use to cover a huge variety of sins. I mean, sometimes I think it's a kind of a magic word we use to make ourselves feel comfortable with things we don't really understand. Say, it's emergent. There's different kinds of emergence. There's the kind you get with, say, a complex system, like the game of life, Conway's Game of Life, where the cells blip on and off, and you get complex phenomena like gliders that move along. Yeah, it's surprising. You wouldn't have expected it. But you can put together the equations, and it's totally predictable. You run the game of life over and again with simple computational rules. It'll be predictable again and again. Evolution is interesting, intermediate case. Maybe given the laws of physics and certain initial conditions, you can run them again and again. I don't know. Maybe it'll turn out evolution arises 60% of the time. If so, that's incredibly cool. And then that ought to be explainable in principle. Now, for consciousness, people sometimes say consciousness is emergent, but there's a gap there of a kind that we haven't even begun to close in the gap of consciousness. People can tell stories about life. People can tell stories about evolution. No one's even begun to tell a story that enables you to predict the existence of consciousness from any number, any amount of underlying physical dynamics. It explains the behavior. It explains how we walk, how we talk. But why that should actually feel like something from the first-person point of view, that is emergent in a much stronger sense. I'd say that's strongly emergent in the sense of it might require new principles to explain.
Max, is there any role of chaos theory in this? Because we know that in principle and in practice, there's some systems that are so complex that you cannot accurately predict its future behavior. Now, is that true even if you had an infinitely powerful computer?
No matter how powerful a computer we build on Earth, we can certainly not predict. We could not have predicted that the Red Sox were going to win the World Series right after they moved to Boston, because precisely of chaos theory, where tiny changes in the positions of some particle, made a huge difference later on. But
just the butterfly effect.
Yeah, if things.
I got to tell you real quick. There's the Journal of Irreproducible Results, which is, if you're a scientist and you come up with something that you know isn't right, but it's a really cool calculation, you publish it there. And it's like, in there you'll find the calculation of what happens if you strap a jellied toast to the back of a cat. Since toast always lands jelly side down, and cats always land on their feet, what would happen if this dropped, okay? And so in the paper, they hypothesized that the cat falls and then hovers over the ground. So it's stupid fun calculations. One of them was, sorry for this interlude, but one of them was, there was some major storm system that happened that hit the east coast of the United States. And someone said, we found the butterfly that caused this. And it's like they killed it and it was on display. So go on. So this butterfly effect.
Yeah. It was apropos complicated emergent phenomena related to chaos and such. I just wanted to come back to what David was saying about consciousness here and kind of connect it with what you opened with here. How can we test with scientific methods these ideas of whether we're simulated or not, or at least update our odds in one way or the other? I think one thing that's great to do is what you're doing, again, looking for the evidence of the simulator cutting corners to make the simulation easier to run. I think another thing we should do is, if you want to test this computation hypothesis that everything is a computation or that everything is mathematical, we should look precisely at the things where we're the most clueless right now about how we would actually describe it mathematically. And I can't think of anything we're more clueless about right now than consciousness, and try our very best to see if we can bring also that in under the tent of things that we can describe with math. And, if we fail spectacularly on that and can realize why, we'll see, wow, our universe is not mathematical. Boom, done. Death to the simulation hypothesis. Whereas, if you and your cronies, as we're told that they're called, succeed, that would, I think, be a big boost for the simulation hypothesis.
And there are people who are pursuing the idea, as you know, that consciousness is fundamentally about information processing in the right way. When information, for example, is integrated in just the right way, maybe you get a kind of consciousness. That's still a very controversial idea and a lot that it doesn't explain. But if something like that is right, it goes very naturally, at least, with the simulation hypothesis, because it's very natural to suppose that in a simulation, there could be all that information being integrated and giving you consciousness. Certain other views just say, for example, consciousness requires a certain very specific intrinsic property, like a certain specific biology. Then there could be a simulation of the whole universe, but if it didn't have that biology, then no consciousness. It would just be a world of unfeeling zombies,
I have a
unfeeling
question,
physical dynamics. So it really makes a difference.
How do you ever show that something can't be described mathematically? You'd have to believe that you understood fundamentally what the degrees of freedom are. So you might just have the wrong description. I mean, even in physics, I mean, we know classic examples where people thought certain things were impossible until just a new law of physics was discovered. I mean, Darwin got the age of the world, our world, closer than the greatest physicists of the time, because Darwin just looked around and Kelvin thought he knew the laws of physics and he didn't get them right. So I don't see how you're ever going to be able to show that something has no mathematical description.
Wait, Max, you're big on the mathematical concept here. What you're saying is everything is mathematics. And if everything is mathematics, then everything is programmable.
That's right. And so I think, as in answer to Lisa's question, David put it very well in the beginning. In physics, we aren't ever able to really prove that something is true. The only people who prove stuff are mathematicians. But if David and Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch and others succeed in this endeavor to try to actually explain consciousness mathematically, it wouldn't prove that things are purely mathematical, but it would certainly be yet the great boost. Because if you just go back, let's go back to Galileo again. We were eulogizing him earlier, right, for his great insights. And when he wrote that our universe is a grand book written in the language of mathematics, that was 400 years ago. And because he was so impressed that things moved in parabolas and things like this. And he had no clue why oranges were orange and hazelnuts were hard and some things were soft. That seemed like it was beyond what you could do with math. Then we got Maxwell's equations, the Schrödinger equation, the standard model of particle physics. More and more has been explained by math. I think Galileo would be really impressed if you were on stage. So it's really cool to look at what are the things left.
I'll invite him next time.
Failed on. Awesome. Yeah. You can reincarnate him and bring him on. So
we'll just have to simulate him. That's what
really
we'll
cool
do.
To look, okay, what's left? Like consciousness, for example, and see if we can also make some progress there. There's no better way to fail on anything, including consciousness understanding, than to tell ourselves, oh, we know it's impossible because of some principles, so let's not try.
Yeah, those aren't good scientists who behave that way.
I think we have to distinguish, though, between the two claims that you can give a mathematical description of everything and you can give a complete mathematical description of everything. Well, even for consciousness, you can obviously give many mathematical descriptions of, color space has certain geometrical properties, the light, the feeling of the light is more and less intense. You can give a very rich mathematical description of it, and that's what, say, someone like Tononi is doing. But can you give an exhaustive mathematical description of it once you've given a full mathematical specification of consciousness? Have you understood everything about it? Or is there some further nature, like the redness of the red or the blueness?
What Max is saying is that previous frontiers in that question were ultimately breached when enough smart people came along to figure it out. So whatever's our state of mind today,
Yeah.
it would be unwise to suggest that it somehow transcends any access that
Yeah.
the future of math
I
might.
mean,
of course
at some
there's-
level, we don't have an exhaustive description of anything because we
Yeah.
understand that there can always be something more fundamental, something we haven't seen yet.
I
So-
agree.
In fact, the very word atom in the Greek means indivisible.
Yeah.
So, yeah, with that,
But while
And
we,
how long did that last? Yeah.
while we have been all bowing at the altar of mathematics, a number of us are aware of this result by Gödel called the incompleteness theorem. And it even says that in some sense, mathematics is incomplete. There are things in mathematics that you cannot prove. That's what the theorems say. And so we, as humans, I
In
think,
fact, Gödel proved it.
yes, yeah, right. He proved it. That's exactly right. He proved
Gödel
it.
proved that math cannot be proven.
That's right.
Yeah.
If it's consistent. There are things that-
Right, if it's
Although-
consistent. If it's
In
consistent.
defense of our universe here, there's absolutely
Somebody's got to defend our universe. So go ahead.
standing
Go.
up for our universe. There's absolutely no evidence that our universe is inconsistent or that mathematics is inconsistent. Gödel said that we humans, we cannot
Right.
prove ever that mathematics is consistent. We cannot prove that it's impossible to prove that 1 equals 2. But I think that's probably more of a reflection of our own of the limitations that thinking beings have, rather than that our universe has some kind of identity crisis. Our universe seems to know exactly what it's doing. It doesn't seem very inconsistent, except when I
Max.
watch presidential debates.
Oh, boy, I'm not going there. But Max, that was precisely my point, that maybe what we're talking about is in fact part of our limitations, not limitations on the universe. But, you know, in science, it's very funny because the way we do science, I like, well, when I give public talks, I like to say, you know, if you look at a family in their house, you might be an anthropologist and record what they do and they turn the appliances off and on, and you might come up with some big record book of this. But then when everybody's out of the house, you might just go to the house and watch how it behaves. You know, the thermostats go up and down, and, you know, maybe you have a timer that does other things. And so the house has a set of rules for operating when you're not there. And in some sense, in science, that's what we're kind of doing. And when we do this kind of split between science, non-science, in some sense, we're talking about how the universe behaves as if we could take our consciousness outside of the universe. And that's a very subtle point to appreciate. And so maybe what this whole discussion has been about is actually just our limitations.
So we're all stupid, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Actually, the universe made us very clever, at least most of us.
So Jim, I got to ask you something. Your discoveries of the sort of checks, error correcting code within the laws of physics themselves at the depths that you're researching them is what I wonder is we live in the age of IT, of information technology. So we all have a certain fluency. So it's in our brains to think that way at some level. Could it be that, you know how the saying goes, if you're a hammer, then all your problems look like nails, and you solve them by hitting them. If now we are in an IT revolution, and you're finding IT solutions to your problems, maybe it's just the fad of the moment, and you're forcing a solution that is either not real or there's a better one awaiting in a revolution that is yet to occur.
Sure. So the last time I was here, I actually misspoke. I used the name of Shannon when I meant Hamming code instead. So first, let me correct that for this wonderful audience.
Error
I meant to
correction
say-
in
That's
action.
right.
Error
Exactly.
correction.
Error correction in action. Absolutely. But in our work, it's first of all, we don't know that it's the physics of our universe. There is a large experiment underway that Lisa knows a lot about in Geneva because she has written papers about possible outcomes in these observations.
Lisa, are you flying to Geneva tomorrow?
I am, but not for that.
Not for that, okay.
So the Large Hadron Collider is going to explore more of the structure of the universe. So first, the mathematics that I have done will only become physics or relevant to nature when the LHC or some other observational device says the idea of supersymmetry is correct. Then it will kick in. So that's a big if. There are lots of physicists that don't believe the universe will be supersymmetric, in which case all I've done is an interesting mathematical fairy tale.
So supersymmetric proposes a whole other regime of particles that are counterparts to the particles we've come to know and love?
Correct.
Okay, and they're yet to be discovered, but they could be describing a whole other parallel reality awaiting our discovery.
But
Well-
even that, I mean, I just want to clarify, we may or may not find evidence at the Large Hadron Collider, which is what's being discussed, but that doesn't even mean that supersymmetry doesn't exist. It means that we can't find the evidence at the scales that we can probe.
Exactly.
So it could be that there is some fundamental symmetry and it's broken at such a high scale that we cannot access any of the evidence of it. And that's the world we live in. I mean, that's what we do as scientists. We try to simulate what we can, we try to derive what we can, we try to measure what we can. And then we have to allow for the possibility that we just haven't had the accuracy, we haven't had the cleverness, or we haven't had the
Technology.
resources to be
Technology.
able to test certain ideas. And so I think that's right, that it's a combination of what's out there and what we can actually do.
So I don't know who among you to ask this directly, so I'll just put it out there in front of you, like a piece of raw meat, and you can just chase after it if you, or you
think we're
vegetarian,
dogs? You
some
think we're
raw
dogs?
carrots, okay? So you can chase after it. I don't know if any of you are vegetarian. So
Can you cook the meat at least?
I'll cook them, okay, we'll cook the meat. My question is, I remember Physics 101 and then 102 and 201 and 202. And as you learn the laws of physics, every now and then something pops up that's just kind of weird. All right, you learn Maxwell's equations, which describes the behavior of electromagnetic radiation, the behavior of light. And they're really beautiful, except there's an asymmetry in there. There's like, you can have particles that have electric fields like electrons, but you don't have isolated particles that are their own magnetic fields. There's always a plus and a minus stuck together. So they're not symmetric that way in the equations. And it's like you cringe when you see that, because part of us wants some beauty and symmetry to the universe if it is, I don't know, we're holding it in very high, we're holding very, very high expectations for what we want to find. And then you go back to the early universe and you find out that 1 out of 100 million photons did not become a photon because symmetry was broken and it made only one matter particle. Whereas all the other interactions had matter and antimatter, they annihilated and became photons. And we are made of this 1 in 100 million stuff that's left over. Something broke in the early universe. And I ask you, why aren't these bugs in the program that we're dealing with?
So I'm going to actually answer that.
You got an answer for that. Very cool. Very cool.
So it's definitely not a bug in the program, because in both these cases, the underlying laws actually do exhibit symmetry. As Jim knows really well, that it has to do, if in our description of electromagnetism, you have electrically charged particles. There's an alternative description where the fundamental particles would be magnetic. That's not the universe we find ourselves in. So a lot of the symmetry is broken by the actual state of the universe we live in. So it could be that the laws of nature have some underlying symmetry that gets broken at some point.
So who's breaking it?
Who's breaking it? The
It's
universe.
not a
The universe is
That's, no, that's not the answer. I'm looking for a little more insight into who's breaking the laws of the universe than just the universe.
Well,
So
here's
first
a
of all-
simple example, okay?
Well,
I
just to
have
be
this-
clear, we come up with what we say are laws, and then if we see an exception, we say that that there's a case where the law is
Okay, I'm
broken.
gonna give you a
And
simple
we're okay
example.
with that.
Suppose I have
It's
a-
the
suppose I
symmetries
have a
that are
pencil
broken.
So sorry,
standing-
symmetries that are
Suppose I
broken.
have a pencil standing on end, a rotational symmetry, right? We'd like to believe that everything's rotationally symmetric. Why should one direction be different? So I have a pencil standing on it. It's going to fall down. It's going to fall down in some direction. Now, who made it fall down in that direction? No one made it fall down in that direction, but it was going to fall down in some direction. So the symmetry is broken. We didn't ask the symmetry to be broken. The fundamental laws were perfectly symmetric, but the symmetry is broken. And there's many things in the universe that are like that. The fundamental laws are symmetric, but the actual universe we live in has broken.
So we can't look for weirdness, because if it is a program that's running, which came up earlier, and we all had programs that crashed, What happens if our program crashes? Do we all disappear, like instantly? What are the consequences to this being a program if someone unplugs it? If there's a bug that crashes the entire system? Is there any piece of the universe where that part of the program failed?
I have it on
Like a
good
big
authority.
spinning
It's
wheel
crashed-
here on the stage going round and round and round.
I have it on good authority. It's crashed 5 times during this panel discussion, but fortunately it rebooted perfectly, and we have no memories of it. So it's like that's just good error correction.
No. So, but Neil, the point you raise, in fact, is for me one of the most uncomfortable ideas about the simulation hypothesis. That it's running on some device, and that the errors would then, how would it manifest itself? Well, in the way that I think most of us think about it, it's kind of the end of the universe. And for me, the universe that I have studied for 50 or 60 years is it's a place of mystery, but it's not a place of the fundamental kind of insane, unleashed chaos that kind of end. Now, we know that we talk about, for example, false vacua. That's something, again, that Lisa knows a lot about because it was pioneered largely by Sidney Coleman, a professor at Harvard before Lisa got there. We know that these possibilities are out there, but the breaking of the symmetries are one thing that's really odd about this is if you don't break the symmetries, you don't get us. You don't get a universe with creatures like us in it unless you break these symmetries. And so maybe the question was,
Simulators like, why did I break those
that's right, the simulation of why am I breaking the symmetry? So, the fact of our existence says something very deep about the mystery of this place we call the universe, because the laws, the symmetric laws, they're beautiful. We write them with simple equations on 1 or 2 lines. But if those laws held exactly, we're not here.
In fact, it's just a universe of photons.
I think that's a very good point you bring up there. At first, it looks like if someone simulated this, they had been drinking too much or whatever. They were really wasteful because you might ask, like, why, if they just wanted to simulate us, did they bother simulating all this dark matter, 6 times as much matter? Obviously increased their CPU cost, what they had to pay for their Uber cloud services, whatever, who needed that?
Plus, we came really late in the universe.
But every single thing we've discovered, like dark matter, for example, that seemed superfluous, we've since discovered that if it weren't there, we would be dead. Or in fact, we wouldn't even have evolved in the first place. If there were no dark matter, for example, then its gravity would have not been there to help pull our galaxy together, and the Milky Way wouldn't even have existed. So it's an interesting question, I think, to ask, is this the simplest kind of simulation you could run that would actually get some interesting life? Or is there something in our universe which is really just bells and whistles that you could optimize out?
So maybe they're just running this kid was doing a science experiment. He ran 1 million simulations overnight, and exactly one of those universes broke the symmetries in the right way to produce conscious beings. And hey, here we are.
Why did they make chiral fermions so difficult to simulate on the lattice?
That's a scientific question, you guys.
So maybe
Harry, yeah.
just adding something to this, instead of just looking at the weirdness and that we observe in the universe, some maybe more fundamental question to ask, again, we can ask why the parameters of our universe, the mass of the electron or the cosmological constant and things like that, why should they have the value they have? I mean, in terms of the simulation scenario, you can sort of start to think this is just an input as many other input. Or the other way to interpret it is that we don't know at a fundamental level what's going on. Maybe there is an embedding theory that would arise that is simpler, it has fewer input, or maybe just one, and then gives you the values of the standard model and all these theories that know to be exactly the same that we observe in nature. So,
well, just to be clear, if any of us program a computer, a simulation of anything, there's a set of parameters that are established up front, and then you watch what happens thereafter. And then you sometimes tweak the parameters if necessary. Some other parameters are non-tweakable. Almost all of our codes, there's a line that gives the value of pi. That's not tweakable.
we don't
My
have any
sons tell me,
mathematical.
for example, that in Minecraft, when you create a Minecraft world, I'm taught by Philip and Alexander, you have to input a world seed.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you put a different one.
Basically, it
universe.
means that we don't have the mathematical equations, for example, to say that the mass of the electron should be what we measure and things like that. So we don't have yet a description as why these have these values. So,
But why should we be, this might have to go back to David, why should we be the measure of what an intellect is and then judge what is hard or what is easy? So in other words, just because we think something is hard because of all of these physical constants that come together so that we exist many billions of years after the universe forms, maybe that's just trivial for anybody who's programming the universe.
Yeah, I mean, it probably is trivial. You know, they've probably got sim universe technology. Everyone's running it on their desktop. I mean, someone at Google in the next universe up
The next universe up. That's not a phrase.
created sim universe, but it's like, okay, set a few parameters, run the universe, no big deal. Some of those universes produce nobody. Some of those universes produce somebody, and those somebodies have to reverse engineer their universe. And it turns out reverse engineering is really hard, whether you're in a simulation or not. But that's just, if you look at it this way, it's just a matter of perspective.
Because when I think of the game tic-tac-toe, to a child, this is a challenging game. They don't know what move to make next. And then they might win or lose, and then they cheer or they're sad. And then you realize this is a pointless game. You can play so that you'll never lose or win. But then it's no longer fun. But to a child, it is it's a game that challenges them. And then we have the game of chess, which challenges us, but you go up an intelligence level and then it's just a trivial exercise. I don't care how many possible moves there are, it's trivial if their brain is a greater brain than ours. And I'm reminded, which one of you may remember, just to correct me if I don't get it right, was it Feynman who first analogized the laws of nature to our attempt to understand the laws of nature would be like coming upon a game of chess and you know nothing of the game. You're just watching people move and you don't have the rule book and you have to deduce what the rules are. And so pretty easily you can see, well, this piece moves this way and this only goes diagonal. You get that. But occasionally one of the pieces jumps 2 squares instead of just 1. Well, why did it do that? You make a note of that, right? And then later on, that little piece that jumped 2, it reaches the other end of the board and then it becomes a whole other piece. That's kind of freaky. It's rare, but it happens, and it's an important rule of the game that most of the time you don't see. And so I'm left wondering how much of a chess game without the instruction manual is the very universe in which we live. To get your answers, one each from that. Yes, Zahora.
maybe starting from the philosopher side.
All right, David, you lead off with that.
I would say that's basically the situation we're in. We call that game, this is the game of reverse engineering the universe, and we call it science. A little bit for philosophy too. It's like, hey, there are clues we could get about we certainly get the equations and so on, but hey, there are clues we could get about the grander structure. Hey, maybe at a certain point we're going to find one of those constants that has an arbitrary value and find there's a coded message in there in the simplest possible language saying, yep, you guessed right, it's a simulation. If so, then that's part of the reverse engineering too. But it's actually a miracle we can understand anything about the world we're in from this perspective. The world could have so much complexity which is completely beyond us, and it could be that we are simply scratching the surface. But I think to do science, you just got to take the optimistic.
But you left me very disappointed earlier in saying that I was trying to find evidence to show that we're not, and that evidence that we're not could be put in by someone who is.
Yeah, I'm
so
afraid.
that was disturbing. So I'm getting back to Zohora's point. What's the point of thinking that way?
Well, you might take on board Occam's razor, which is if we don't need the hypothesis that we're in a simulation, then we should just do without that hypothesis. Maybe science is going to tell us a bunch of math, it's a bunch of equations. Yeah, that could be combined with the further hypothesis we're in a simulation. It's a lot simpler if we're not. So maybe Occam's razor at least says, why bother? Then on the other hand, you got Bostrom's statistical argument. We might actually produce a whole lot of simulations and have very good reason to believe there are a lot of simulations in the universe, in which case you can just raise the question. We know some people are in simulations. we cannot assign at least probability 0 to us. And at that point, it becomes a statistical question. So I think the standard scientific reasoning of Occam's razor might give some reason to reject it, but the statistics starts to maybe balance that another way. And around a certain point, you got to start doing some math about the probability.
So Occam's razor actually goes very far back, I think, to the 14th century, where was it the Earl of Occam, was it, who suggested
William Occam.
that the of all explanations, perhaps the simplest has the best chance of being correct, and that was well before the methods of the scientific method and others. So we've been using it, invoking it ever since. So Lisa, is the universe a chessboard, and we're
So I was very much with you until the very end. So I think it is indeed true that we don't know the answer, and we're just going to keep doing science till it fails. And it hasn't failed yet. It seems to we make progress, and so we're going to keep doing that. In terms of are we trying to figure it out? I actually love the idea that we're a simulation where they actually kind of saved in efficiency by making us not quite smart enough to figure all of this stuff out. That's too much computational power, so let's make them a little bit dumber. So, but I do have, I understand it's a possibility there's a simulation, but there is a problem with the statistical argument. I think if you asked any statistician, there's just not based on well-defined probabilities here. And actually one of the key, so Bostrom's argument would say that also that you have lots of things simulating things, and lots of things that want to simulate us. And I actually really have a problem with that. And why simulate us? There's so many things to simulate. None of us actually get together and, we simulate processes or whatever, but we mostly are interested in ourselves. I don't know why this higher species would want to.
Maybe they don't care about us. They just simulate a bunch of physics or a bunch of laws, and hey, we came along as a byproduct.
Yeah, it's in the realm of possibility. But
so we grew out of their petri dish.
But I do think that, again, ultimately, what as physicists, as scientists, we're interested in are the things that we can actually test. So to the extent that it gives us an incentive to ask interesting questions, like, do we see cosmic rays at different energies or from different directions, going at slightly different speeds or anything of that nature, or do we find the laws? That's certainly worth doing to see what is the extent of the laws of physics as we understand them. But that is what we're doing anyway, but maybe we'll be presented with a bunch of other questions. But that is, so it's a little bit of a systematic way of figuring out the chess game, because in the case of the chess game, you have many games, you can watch many games. Here we have this one universe, and we can try to make little tests within that universe to try to test laws. But those apply in those little rounds. One of the brilliant things about Galileo was he realized there's many ways to do science. There's thought experiments, there's observations, but he actually came up with the idea of experiments themselves.
We're bringing him to the next panel.
Yeah, I know. I'm so excited about it. You might be that one too. So that's just the nature of science. So I think we are trying to figure it out to the extent we can.
Jim.
I think you nailed it with the chess game analogy. One thing that I think that oftentimes when I talk to people is, and Lisa alluded to this very well, is that a lot of people think it's all about them. They really do. They think it's all about them. They have to understand things that's somehow related to them. It's all about them. And I think that one of the things that science actually teaches us is that it's not all about us. We may be struggling with the description that we're trying to construct, but the universe doesn't care whether I understand or don't understand. The universe doesn't care whether I exist or not exist. The universe, at least as I have studied it, is, I'm going to retreat into Einstein. At the end of the day, it is an extraordinary mystery. That's the sense that I get from having studied science for now 50 years almost. That we live in this place of mystery, and we need to accept a humbleness about our efforts to go out and explain that chess game that you described.
Ooh. Max.
I fully agree with you that the world would be a better place if we humans could be a bit more humble. At the same time, I also feel that the very soul of physics is this audacity to look for a hidden simplicity in things. So I think the metaphor of chess is a beautiful one. We have as a goal in physics to look at this very complicated and messy seeming universe and look for hidden simplicity, look for rules of chess which are actually simple, not the list of one Googleplex different possible things, or not just saying it's all random. And of course, we don't know yet whether there are rules that are simple enough that our human minds can understand them or not. But I'm an optimist, and I feel it's actually much healthier as scientists if we have this innate optimism. Instead of saying, well, it might be they were too dumb to ever figure this out, so let's just not try. I think it's much healthier to say there is a real possibility that there is this hidden simplicity. And in fact, Galileo and Einstein and so many before us have found simplicity far beyond what their ancestors ever dreamt of, right? So let's keep looking for even more hidden simplicity. Maybe this is actually all computational or mathematical, which would be, that's in a way the ultimate audacity to hope for that, because that would mean that in principle, at least, it really is possible to figure out the rules of the game. That's the attitude I like to take. Consider the possibility it is possible, and then try our very, very best to actually figure it out.
Thank you, Mario, for that. And Morpheus. So, Zohore.
I would like to deviate a little bit more from your question very quickly, because it didn't came up in the discussions, but I want to distinguish between the idea that we can simulate the universe as opposed to the universe being a simulation, because there are fundamental limits to our capability to actually compute things, and these are based on the physical laws that govern our universe. Basically, we can't have infinite power. The energy, the laws that govern basically the uncertainty principle can limit the rate that we can process logical operations, and also the entropy and thermodynamic laws can limit the amount of memory that we can hold in a given amount of space-time, and things, ideas like this that were discussed by Steph Lloyd and other people. And therefore, we might not be able to actually, and there are other actually limits when you think about larger scale and expansion of the universe, whether or not you can ever causally connect to parts of the universe that is expanding, and therefore store and process those information, be able to actually re-simulate the universe that we have. So it's a different idea. I don't think that based on the physical laws of our nature, this could be possible, but that doesn't mean that our universe could not be a simulation inside another universe that has another laws of physics that doesn't actually limit the amount of computation that is required to simulate the universe. So these are two different ideas. But just to come back to your question, I think as a physicist, thinking about the simulation idea, I think it doesn't change the way I think about the science, and I do my everyday job as a scientist. I think just the notion of whether or not we're real or this is simulated, it's kind of irrelevant, because what we're observing is no different from being real or imaginary. We just go and discover things that we already don't know about the universe, the laws that we haven't discovered, but at some point maybe we find some sort of more strong evidence that could connect us to a higher level that says something about whether or not the universe is computational based, and there is some simulator beside us. These are the ideas that require more thinking and more thinking out of the box, I would say, at the moment, but maybe at some point in future, when we have more understanding of the laws of our universe, we can have more rigorous way to go and look for those evidences and say something meaningful. At this point, I think there is no such evidence. We've just started to make assumptions by just comparing our simulations of the universe and see what would be the consequences of those kind of assumptions. But at the moment, we don't have such evidence, and it would be wrong to put a lot of focus on this idea. But it's definitely a very fun and curious idea to think about as a scientist, and therefore I think that's why I do science. And
I just have to alert you that she actually knows the answer to your chess question and she's just not telling us because you're Persian and you Persians invented chess.
Yeah, I actually played that game and I was very, very young. So it's.
So she does have the answer. Let me just end before we transition to Q&A. I want to get the likelihood that you think we are in a simulation. 10% chance, 20%. What? Just give me a number. Just a number. Go.
I can't give you that number. I don't have any evidence.
She's not authorized to divulge that information. Okay, so you give a no answer. Max?
17%.
17%. Jim? Morpheus?
1%.
1% chance.
I'm going with effectively zero.
Effectively zero. David?
42%.
So I think the likelihood may be very high. And my evidence for it is just, it's a thought experiment and it's simple. We'll just end with this reflection. And I'm elsewhere, like on YouTube, saying this, so you can check it out again later if you choose. I just think when I look at what we measure to be our own intelligence, and we tend to think highly of it. Getting back to Jim's point, there's a certain hubris just even in how we think about our relationship to the world. And it's understandable, perhaps, even in the search for intelligent life in the universe. It comes with the assumption that we will find life that also thinks we are intelligent. Well, if we look at other life forms on Earth with whom we have DNA in common, there is none that we would rank ever in the history of the fossil record or life thriving today that we would rank with us and our level of intelligence. So given our definitions, we're the only intelligent species there ever was because we have poetry and philosophy and music and art. And then I thought to myself, well, if the chimpanzee has 98 whatever percent identical DNA to us, pick any animal, doesn't matter, dogs, doesn't matter. Mammals have very close DNA to us. They cannot do trigonometry. Some people can't do trigonometry, certainly not these animals. So if they cannot do trigonometry and they have such close genetic identity to us, let's take that same gap and put it beyond us and find some life form that is that much beyond us that we are beyond the dog or the chimp. What would we look like to them? We would be drooling, blithering idiots in their presence. The smartest chimp can do maybe some sign language and stack boxes and reach a banana, put up an umbrella, like our toddlers can do. Our toddlers do that. So maybe the smartest human, you bring Stephen Hawking forward in front of this other species, and they're chuckling because they'll say, oh, this happens to be the smartest human because he's slightly smarter than the rest because he can do astrophysics calculations in his head, like little Timmy over here. Oh, you're back from preschool. Oh, you just composed a symphony. That's so beautiful. Just put it on the refrigerator door. Or you just derived all the principles of math. Oh, that's cute. And so that is not a stretch to think about. And if that's the case, it is easy for me to imagine that everything in our lives is just the creation of some other entity for their entertainment. It is easy for me to think that. So whatever the likelihood is, 0%, 1%, 17, 42, no answer. I'm saying the day we learn that it is true, I will be the only one in the room saying, I'm not surprised. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank the panel. We will bring up the lights, and in this transition between the formal part of the panel and the Q&A that we'll be taking from you, I just want to tell you just what it takes to run this thing. As I told you earlier, it was formed by an endowment created by Isaac Asimov's widow, Janet Asimov, and friends of Isaac Asimov. And we've been going strong ever since. And so I just want to say we have people who run this thing. We have Susan Morris, who's director of Hayden Programs. We Where's Susan? Susan is out there. And we have Emily Haydet. She's also part of this team that makes this work. We have my executive assistant, Elizabeth Stachow. We have Laura Jean Checky, who's our stage manager. We have some fans of Laura in the audience. Good. We have Marion Posner, who has been with us like forever and is a diehard supporter as a volunteer of our programs. Lydia Marie Petrosino. Did I pronounce that right? Lydia, I only ever call you Lydia Marie, but Lydia Marie is good. And of course, we have Betty Walrand. These are people who make this happen every single year. I just want to collectively give them applause.